The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical vest. She had been through countless combat scenarios, but today felt different. The air was thick with tension, and even the birds seemed to have gone silent. Sarah was part of an elite military unit known for their precision and discipline. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers through years of rigorous training and real combat experience. Her teammates often joked that she could take apart and reassemble any weapon blindfolded, but Sarah knew that skill meant nothing if you couldn't adapt when everything went wrong. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence suggested that a group of enemy commandos had infiltrated their sector. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were highly trained operatives with years of experience in guerrilla warfare. The plan was simple: locate, engage, and neutralize the threat before they could reach their target. Sarah's unit consisted of 12 soldiers, each handpicked for their expertise. They had trained together for months, developing an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements and tactics. Trust was everything in their line of work, and Sarah trusted these men and women with her life. As they moved through the dense forest that surrounded the compound, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The intelligence reports had been vague, and the enemy's location kept changing. It felt like they were being led into a trap, but headquarters insisted the mission proceed as planned. The team spread out in a standard formation, with Sarah taking point alongside her longtime partner, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez. They had served together for 3 years, and Mike had saved her life more than once. His steady presence always helped calm her nerves before a difficult operation. "Something doesn't feel right about this," Mike whispered into his radio as they approached a clearing marked on their maps. "The intel seems too clean, too convenient." Sarah shared his concerns, but knew they had to follow orders. Intelligence gathering was never perfect, and hesitation could cost lives. She signaled for the team to maintain their positions while she scouted ahead. The clearing was roughly 50 meters across, surrounded by thick trees that provided excellent cover. According to their maps, this was where the enemy commandos were supposed to be hiding. But as Sarah peered through her scope, she saw nothing but empty space and scattered leaves dancing in the breeze. That's when she heard the first shot. The sound echoed through the forest like thunder, and Sarah instinctively dropped to the ground. Her training kicked in immediately as she scanned for the source of the gunfire. Mike's voice crackled through her earpiece, but she couldn't make out his words over the sudden chaos that erupted around them. More shots followed, coming from multiple directions. Sarah realized with growing horror that they had indeed walked into a trap. The enemy commandos weren't hiding in the clearing. They had surrounded the entire area and waited for Sarah's team to position themselves perfectly for an ambush. "We're surrounded." Mike's voice finally came through clearly. "They've got us pinned down from at least 4 positions." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the situation. Her team was scattered across the forest, caught completely off guard by an enemy that had clearly been watching their movements for hours, maybe even days. The professional part of her brain began calculating angles and escape routes, but another part wondered how their intelligence could have been so wrong. As bullets whizzed overhead, Sarah crawled toward a fallen log that would provide better cover. She could hear her teammates returning fire, but it was clear they were at a severe disadvantage. The enemy had chosen their positions well, using the natural terrain to create overlapping fields of fire that made movement nearly impossible. "Status report." Sarah called into her radio, trying to get a clear picture of their situation. "Rodriguez here. I'm pinned behind that big oak tree about 30 meters from your position." Mike's voice was strained but steady. "I can see muzzle flashes from at least 2 different locations." Thompson reporting in, came another voice. "I've got eyes on movement to the northeast, approximately 100 meters out. These guys know what they're doing." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Professional soldiers were dangerous enough when you could see them coming, but facing an unknown number of highly trained commandos in an ambush situation was every soldier's worst nightmare. The fact that they had been so completely outmaneuvered suggested they were dealing with elite operatives, possibly special forces from an enemy nation. The gunfire intensified, and Sarah could tell that her team was being systematically suppressed. The enemy wasn't trying to kill them quickly. They were using controlled, precise fire to keep everyone pinned down while they maneuvered into better positions. It was a textbook military tactic, executed with the kind of precision that only came from years of training and combat experience. "We need to move," Sarah called out. "They're trying to surround us completely." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that movement might be impossible. The enemy had clearly studied their tactics and anticipated their likely responses. Every potential escape route seemed to be covered by at least one shooter, and attempting to break out would likely result in casualties her team couldn't afford. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to understand the true scope of their predicament. This wasn't just a simple ambush. It was a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate her entire unit. The enemy had used their own intelligence against them, feeding them false information that led them directly into a killing ground. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. These were her people, her friends, and they were trapped because of decisions made by people sitting safely behind desks hundreds of miles away. But dwelling on that wouldn't save anyone's life. She needed to focus on finding a way out of this impossible situation. "Listen up, everyone," Sarah called into her radio, forcing her voice to remain calm and authoritative. "We're dealing with professionals here, but we're professionals too. We've trained for this exact scenario, and we're going to get through it together." But even as she spoke those words, Sarah wondered if she truly believed them. The enemy had every advantage: superior position, better intelligence, and the element of surprise. Her team was outgunned, outnumbered, and caught in the open with limited cover. In military terms, their situation was almost hopeless. The sound of approaching footsteps through the underbrush told Sarah that the enemy was beginning to close in for the final phase of their attack. The forest erupted into chaos as the enemy commandos revealed their true positions. What Sarah had initially thought was gunfire from 4 directions quickly became clear was actually a coordinated attack from at least 8 different positions. The enemy had spent considerable time preparing this ambush, and their execution was flawless. Sarah pressed herself against the fallen log, feeling the rough bark scrape against her tactical vest as bullets splintered the wood just inches above her head. The sound was deafening, not just the crack of rifle fire, but the whistle of bullets passing overhead and the thud of rounds hitting trees and rocks around their position. "Rodriguez, can you see anything from your position?" Sarah called into her radio, having to shout to be heard over the gunfire. "Negative." Mike's response was punctuated by the sound of his own weapon returning fire. "These guys are good. They're using proper fire and movement tactics. As soon as I get a bead on one position, they're already moving to another." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the full implications of what Mike had just said. They weren't dealing with ordinary soldiers or even standard military units. The enemy was employing advanced small unit tactics that required months of specialized training to master. Fire and movement was a technique where some team members provided covering fire while others moved to better positions, creating a constantly shifting battlefield that made it nearly impossible to predict where the next attack would come from. The sound of breaking branches to her left caught Sarah's attention. Through the thick underbrush, she could make out the shape of someone moving carefully through the trees. The figure was dressed in camouflage that perfectly matched the forest environment, and their movements showed the careful discipline of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of staying invisible. Sarah raised her rifle and tried to get a clear shot, but the commando was using the natural cover expertly. Every time she thought she had a target, the figure would disappear behind a tree or drop into a depression in the ground. It was like trying to shoot at a ghost. "Contact left," Sarah called into her radio. "I've got movement approximately 50 meters out, but I can't get a clean shot." "Same here," came Thompson's voice from somewhere to her right. "I'm seeing multiple targets, but they're staying behind cover. It's like they know exactly where we are." A horrible thought occurred to Sarah. What if the enemy didn't know exactly where they were? What if this ambush had been planned not just for days, but for weeks or even months? The intelligence that had led them here could have been deliberately planted, giving the enemy time to study their unit's tactics and prepare countermeasures for every possible response. The gunfire shifted patterns suddenly, becoming more concentrated and focused. Sarah realized that the enemy was beginning to isolate individual members of her team, cutting them off from each other and preventing coordinated responses. It was a classic military tactic called divide and conquer, but seeing it executed with such precision was terrifying. "Peterson, report your status." Sarah called into her radio. Silence. "Peterson, do you copy?" Still nothing. Sarah's blood ran cold. Peterson was one of their youngest team members, fresh out of advanced training, but eager to prove himself. The thought that something might have happened to him filled Sarah with a mixture of rage and desperation. "I can see Peterson's position," came Miller's voice over the radio. "He's pinned down behind some rocks about 70 meters northeast of the clearing. He looks okay, but he's completely surrounded." Sarah felt a moment of relief, followed immediately by renewed concern. If Peterson was surrounded, it meant the enemy was already beginning to close the net around individual team members. Soon, they would all be isolated and vulnerable to capture or worse. The sound of footsteps was getting closer now, and Sarah could hear voices speaking in a foreign language. The words were too quiet and distorted to make out clearly, but the tone was professional and calm. These commandos weren't panicked or excited. They were methodically executing a plan they had rehearsed many times before. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of options. Standard military doctrine called for several possible responses to an ambush situation: fight through it, retreat to a defensible position, or call for backup. But all of those options required advantages that her team simply didn't have. Fighting through the ambush would require coordinated movement and overwhelming firepower. Her team was scattered and outgunned, making coordination nearly impossible. Retreating would mean exposing themselves while moving across open ground, which would be suicide given the enemy's superior positions. And calling for backup would take time they didn't have, assuming communications weren't being jammed. "All units, this is Mitchell," Sarah spoke into her radio, trying to keep her voice steady and authoritative despite the chaos around her. "We need to try a breakout maneuver. On my signal, everyone provide covering fire toward the northeast while Team Alpha moves to—" Her words were cut off as a new sound reached her ears, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar fire. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as she realized that the enemy had brought indirect fire weapons to the fight. Mortars would allow them to attack positions that were protected from direct gunfire, eliminating any advantage that cover might provide. "Incoming!" Sarah screamed into her radio. "Everyone find hard cover. They've got mortars." The first mortar round exploded about 30 meters away, sending dirt and debris flying through the air. The concussion wave hit Sarah like a physical blow, making her ears ring and her vision blur. She pressed herself as close to the ground as possible, knowing that the next rounds would likely be closer as the enemy adjusted their aim. The second explosion was much closer, and Sarah felt fragments of hot metal whistling past her head. The enemy mortar team was walking their fire closer to her position with each shot, a standard technique for maximizing casualties while minimizing ammunition expenditure. "Rodriguez," Sarah called into her radio. "We need to move now, or we're all going to be killed." "I know." Mike's voice came back, strained with effort. "But they've got us completely boxed in. Every time someone tries to move, they get pinned down by sniper fire." Sarah's heart was pounding as she realized the true hopelessness of their situation. The enemy had planned this ambush with military precision, accounting for every possible response her team might attempt. They had snipers positioned to prevent movement, automatic weapons to suppress any attempt at coordinated fire, and now mortars to eliminate anyone who tried to take shelter behind solid cover. As the third mortar round exploded even closer to her position, Sarah made a desperate decision. She couldn't save everyone by playing defensively and waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Sometimes the only way to survive an impossible situation was to do something so unexpected that it caught the enemy off guard. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, mentally cataloging every weapon and piece of gear she was carrying. Her primary rifle, 2 fragmentation grenades, a combat knife, and her sidearm. It wasn't much against an unknown number of highly trained commandos, but it would have to be enough. The 4th mortar round landed less than 20 meters away, showering Sarah with dirt and small rocks. She could hear her teammates calling for help on the radio, their voices becoming more desperate as the situation deteriorated further. Time was running out, and soon the enemy would close in for the final assault. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to make the most important decision of her military career. Everything she had trained for, everything she believed about duty and protecting her teammates came down to this moment. She was about to attempt something that violated every principle of small unit tactics she had ever learned, but it might be their only chance. Sarah gripped her rifle tighter as she prepared to break cover, but before she could move, disaster struck. A sniper's bullet found its mark with devastating precision, striking her primary weapon just as she was raising it to return fire. The impact sent a shock wave through her hands and arms, and she watched in horror as her rifle was literally torn from her grasp. The bullet had hit the weapon's receiver at exactly the right angle to render it completely useless. Metal fragments scattered across the ground as Sarah stared at what remained of her primary means of defense. In less than a second, she had gone from being a heavily armed soldier to someone with nothing but her sidearm and whatever other equipment she could carry. "My weapon's down," Sarah called into her radio, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "Sniper got a direct hit on my rifle." The implications of losing her primary weapon went far beyond just having less firepower. Her rifle had been equipped with advanced optics that allowed her to engage targets at long range, as well as an underbarrel grenade launcher that could have been crucial in breaking up enemy positions. Without it, she was essentially limited to close-range combat with her pistol and whatever improvised weapon she could find. Mike's voice crackled through her earpiece, tight with concern. "Sarah, you need to get a cover and stay there. Without your rifle, you can't engage at distance." But even as Mike spoke, Sarah could hear the enemy commandos getting closer. Their voices were becoming clearer, and she could make out the sound of equipment rattling as they moved through the underbrush. They knew that one of the defenders had lost their primary weapon, and they were moving to take advantage of that weakness. Sarah's military training had prepared her for many different scenarios, but losing your primary weapon in the middle of an active firefight was considered one of the worst possible situations. Without a rifle, she couldn't provide covering fire for her teammates, couldn't engage enemies at safe distances, and couldn't contribute effectively to any coordinated defensive efforts. The sound of another mortar round whistling overhead reminded Sarah that staying in her current position wasn't an option. The enemy was systematically destroying every piece of cover in the area, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. She needed to move, but without her rifle, any movement would be extremely dangerous. Sarah quickly assessed her remaining equipment. Her sidearm was a reliable pistol with 3 magazines of ammunition, but pistols were notoriously ineffective against targets more than 20 or 30 meters away. She also had 2 fragmentation grenades, which could be useful for clearing enemy positions, but only if she could get close enough to throw them accurately. Her combat knife might be effective in close-quarters fighting, but the idea of engaging trained commandos in hand-to-hand combat was terrifying. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were elite operatives who had probably received extensive training in martial arts and close combat techniques. "Thompson, what's your status?" Sarah called into her radio, hoping that at least some of her teammates were still in fighting condition. "I'm okay for now," Thompson's voice came back, "but I'm running low on ammunition. I count at least 6 different enemy positions, and they're all equipped with automatic weapons." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Not only had Sarah lost her primary weapon, but her entire team was running low on ammunition while facing a numerically superior enemy force. In military terms, they were experiencing what was known as a cascade failure. Multiple critical problems occurring simultaneously, each one making the others worse. Sarah could hear her teammates calling for backup on the radio, but the responses from headquarters were not encouraging. The nearest friendly units were at least an hour away, and helicopter support was unavailable due to weather conditions. They were truly on their own. As the enemy mortars continued to fall around their positions, Sarah realized that conventional military tactics were no longer an option. Her team was outgunned, outnumbered, and rapidly running out of both ammunition and cover. Any attempt to fight a traditional defensive battle would result in their complete destruction. The thought of surrender briefly crossed Sarah's mind, but she dismissed it immediately. These commandos hadn't been trying to capture prisoners. They had been systematically destroying her team's positions with the clear intent of eliminating all witnesses to their presence. Surrendering would likely mean execution for her and her teammates. "Rodriguez," Sarah called into her radio. "I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to try something that goes against everything we've ever been trained to do." "What are you talking about?" Mike's voice was strained as he continued to return fire from his position. "I'm going to go on the offensive," Sarah said, checking her pistol and grenades one final time. "I know it sounds crazy, but if we stay here, we're all going to die anyway." "Sarah, you've lost your primary weapon." Mike's voice was urgent. "You can't take on multiple trained commandos with just a pistol." Sarah knew that Mike was right from a purely tactical standpoint. Every military manual ever written would classify what she was about to attempt as suicide. Engaging multiple enemies at close range with only a sidearm was the kind of mistake that got soldiers killed and officers court-martialed. But Sarah also knew that sometimes the most dangerous course of action was also the only one that offered any chance of survival. The enemy commandos had planned for every conventional response her team might attempt. They had positioned themselves to counter standard military tactics, prepared overlapping fields of fire to prevent movement, and brought enough firepower to overwhelm any defensive positions. What they probably hadn't planned for was a single soldier abandoning all defensive positions and launching a direct assault against superior numbers with minimal equipment. It was so tactically unsound that no reasonable military planner would consider it a legitimate threat. The sound of approaching footsteps told Sarah that the enemy was beginning to close in for the final phase of their attack. She could hear them communicating in their foreign language, coordinating their movements as they prepared to overrun her team's positions. In a few more minutes, it would all be over. Sarah took a deep breath and made peace with what she was about to do. She thought about her teammates, who were depending on her to find a way out of this impossible situation. She thought about her training, which had taught her that sometimes a leader had to make decisions that others couldn't or wouldn't make. And she thought about the oath she had taken when she became a soldier, promising to protect her country and her fellow service members regardless of the personal cost. The fifth mortar round exploded just 10 meters away, close enough that Sarah could feel the heat from the blast. Dirt and debris rained down on her position, and she knew that the next round would likely be a direct hit. The time for hesitation was over. Sarah checked her pistol one final time, ensuring that a round was chambered and the safety was off. She pulled the pins from both of her grenades, but kept the safety levers depressed, turning them into weapons that she could deploy instantly when the moment was right. Her combat knife was secured in its sheath, but positioned for quick access. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of her cover, Sarah's mind went completely calm. All the fear and uncertainty disappeared, replaced by the cold focus that came from absolute commitment to a course of action. She was no longer thinking about survival or tactics or the odds against her. She was thinking only about the next 65 seconds and what she needed to accomplish in that brief span of time. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah exploded from her covered position, moving with a speed and determination that caught everyone by surprise. The first enemy commando she encountered was advancing through the trees about 15 meters from her position, his attention focused on where he thought she was hiding behind a fallen log. Sarah's years of combat training took over completely as she sprinted toward him in a zigzag pattern that made her a difficult target to track. The commando heard her movement and began to turn, but Sarah was already inside his effective range before he could bring his weapon to bear. Her pistol fired twice in rapid succession, both rounds finding their target with deadly precision. The sound of gunfire alerted the other commandos to Sarah's unexpected assault, but their response was delayed by confusion and disbelief. No rational soldier would abandon cover to attack multiple enemies with only a sidearm, and their tactical training hadn't prepared them for such an irrational response. Sarah didn't pause to confirm her first target was down. She was already moving toward the second commando, who was positioned behind a large tree about 20 meters away. This one had heard the gunshots and was turning to engage, but Sarah was moving faster than he could react effectively. As she ran, Sarah pulled the safety lever from her first grenade and counted off the seconds before throwing it toward a cluster of rocks where she had seen muzzle flashes earlier. The grenade arced through the air with perfect timing, exploding just as it reached the optimal position to clear the enemy position. The explosion sent dirt and debris flying in all directions, and Sarah could hear shouts of pain and confusion from at least two different voices. But she couldn't stop to assess the damage. The second commando was already bringing his rifle around to track her movement. Sarah dove to the ground just as the commando's rifle fired, feeling the bullet pass so close to her head that it displaced the air around her ear. She rolled sideways and came up firing, her pistol barking 3 times in rapid succession. The first shot missed, but the second and third found their mark, dropping the second commando before he could fire again. By now, the remaining enemy forces were beginning to respond to Sarah's assault with coordinated fire. Bullets whistled past her position as she sprinted toward a third commando who was trying to set up a firing position behind a fallen tree. The enemy's accuracy was being affected by their confusion and the speed of Sarah's movement, but she knew her luck couldn't last much longer. Sarah's tactical mind was operating on pure instinct now, calculating angles and distances without conscious thought. She could see the third commando's position clearly, but she also spotted movement from a fourth enemy who was trying to flank her from the left. If she engaged the third target directly, the fourth would have a clear shot at her from the side. Without breaking stride, Sarah pulled the pin from her second grenade and threw it toward the fourth commando's position while simultaneously drawing her combat knife with her free hand. The timing had to be perfect. She needed to neutralize the third target in close combat before the grenade exploded and alerted any remaining enemies to her exact location. The third commando was skilled and experienced, but Sarah's unexpected close-range assault with a knife caught him completely off guard. He had been preparing to engage targets at rifle range, not defend against a knife attack. Sarah's blade found its mark before he could adjust to the new threat, and she was already moving again before his body hit the ground. The grenade exploded right on schedule, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of metal fragments hitting trees and rocks. A scream of pain told her that at least one enemy had been caught in the blast, but she couldn't tell how many others might still be operational. Sarah's pistol magazine was now empty, and she performed a lightning-fast reload while running toward where she had last seen enemy muzzle flashes. Her movements were becoming more desperate now as her initial burst of surprise began to wear off, and the remaining commandos started to coordinate their response more effectively. A burst of automatic weapons fire forced Sarah to dive behind a boulder, but she used a momentary cover to scan for her next target. Through the chaos and smoke, she could see at least one more commando try to reposition himself for a better shot. His movements suggested he might be wounded from the grenade blast, but he was still armed and dangerous. Sarah's heart was pounding, but her mind remained focused and clear. She had committed to this course of action, and there was no turning back now. Every second counted, and hesitation would mean death for both her and her teammates. Rising from cover with her freshly reloaded pistol, Sarah engaged the wounded commando before he could complete his repositioning maneuver. The range was longer than ideal for a pistol, but Sarah's marksmanship training paid off as her shots found their target despite the difficult conditions. The forest suddenly seemed much quieter, with only the ringing in Sarah's ears and the distant sound of her teammates' voices on the radio. She remained in a combat crouch, scanning for additional threats while her mind tried to process what had just happened. In exactly 65 seconds, she had engaged and neutralized 4 highly trained enemy commandos using only her sidearm, 2 grenades, and a combat knife. It was the kind of combat action that military instructors taught was impossible, the kind of scenario that existed only in movies and fiction. But as Sarah maintained her defensive position and waited to see if any other enemies would reveal themselves, she knew that the engagement wasn't over yet. There could be additional commandos in the area, and her teammates were still pinned down by unknown threats. Her desperate gamble had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations, but the mission was far from complete. The sound of Mike's voice calling her name through the radio brought Sarah back to full awareness of her surroundings. She had survived the impossible, but now she needed to help her teammates survive as well. The next few minutes would determine whether her desperate assault had been a brilliant tactical success or merely a lucky moment before ultimate disaster. Sarah checked her ammunition and equipment, preparing for whatever would come next. She had proven that sometimes the most irrational course of action was also the most effective, but she also knew that luck and surprise could only take her so far. The real test would be what happened when her enemies adapted to her unconventional tactics and began fighting back with their full capabilities. The forest fell into an eerie silence as Sarah maintained her defensive position, scanning for any remaining threats. Her heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of combat, but her mind was beginning to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 65 seconds of pure instinct and determination, she had completely reversed the tactical situation. Sarah, are you okay?" Mike's voice crackled through her radio, filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I'm okay," Sarah responded, still keeping her weapon ready as she continued to watch for movement. 4 targets down. I need status reports from everyone else." One by one, her teammates began checking in. The sudden elimination of 4 enemy commandos had broken the coordinated attack that had been systematically destroying their defensive positions. The remaining enemy forces, if any still existed, had apparently withdrawn rather than continue the engagement without their tactical advantage. Thompson's voice came through the radio with obvious amazement. "Sarah, I watched most of that through my scope. I've never seen anything like it in 15 years of military service. How did you even survive that assault?" Sarah didn't have a good answer for that question. By all military logic, her attack should have been suicide. She had been outnumbered, outgunned, and attacking prepared positions with minimal equipment. The fact that she had not only survived, but completely defeated 4 elite commandos seemed to defy every principle of small unit tactics. "Sometimes you have to do the unexpected," Sarah replied, finally beginning to lower her weapon as it became clear that the immediate threat had passed. They were prepared for everything except someone stupid enough to attack them head-on. As her teammates began to emerge from their defensive positions, Sarah walked back through the area where the engagement had taken place. The evidence of the brief but violent combat was scattered throughout the forest: spent ammunition, blast marks from the grenades, and the equipment left behind by the fallen commandos. Mike approached her with her expression of profound respect, mixed with concern. "Sarah, what you just did goes against everything we've ever been taught about small unit tactics. You could have been killed a dozen different ways." Sarah nodded, understanding his point completely. "I know, but we were all going to die anyway if we stayed defensive. Sometimes the only way to win an impossible situation is to change the rules of engagement completely." As they began to secure the area and tend to their wounded, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned from this encounter. The enemy commandos had been skilled, professional, and well-prepared, but they had also been limited by their own tactical training. They had planned for every conventional response except the one that Sarah had chosen. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of what they had faced. The enemy commandos were indeed elite operatives, part of a special forces unit that had been conducting reconnaissance operations deep behind friendly lines. Their equipment and training were among the best in the world, and they had been responsible for several successful operations against military targets. Intelligence analysts were amazed when they reviewed the after-action reports. The idea that a single soldier armed only with a pistol and grenades had defeated 4 members of an elite special forces unit in direct combat seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable, and Sarah's actions began to be studied as an example of how individual initiative and unconventional thinking could overcome seemingly hopeless tactical situations. The psychological impact of Sarah's assault had been just as important as the physical casualties she had inflicted. The enemy commandos had been operating under the assumption that they understood their opponent's capabilities and likely responses. When Sarah did something that violated all their tactical assumptions, it created confusion and hesitation that proved fatal. Military historians would later classify Sarah's action as an example of tactical shock, a situation where one side gains an overwhelming advantage not through superior firepower or numbers, but by doing something so unexpected that it completely disrupts the enemy's decision-making process. The effect was similar to what happened when new technologies or tactics were first introduced in warfare, creating temporary but decisive advantages for those willing to use them. Sarah's teammates had been saved not just by her marksmanship and combat skills, but by her willingness to abandon conventional wisdom and take enormous personal risks for the sake of others. It was the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught in schools or training programs. It came from a combination of skill, courage, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated exceptional soldiers from merely competent ones. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's actions were recognized with commendations and awards, but she remained uncomfortable with the attention. She understood that what she had done was extraordinary, but she also knew that it had been born from desperation rather than careful planning. The same tactics that had worked in this specific situation might be completely ineffective under different circumstances. The most important lesson from the engagement wasn't about combat techniques or weapons handling. It was about the importance of adapting to unexpected situations and being willing to take calculated risks when conventional approaches weren't working. Sarah's success hadn't come from superior equipment or overwhelming force, but from her ability to think clearly under pressure and take decisive action when her teammates' lives were at stake. The enemy's careful planning and professional execution had ultimately been defeated by one person's refusal to accept an impossible situation. In military terms, Sarah had achieved what theorists called a force multiplier effect, a situation where individual actions have an impact far beyond what their scale would normally suggest. As Sarah cleaned her equipment and prepared for the helicopter extraction that would take her team back to base, she thought about the lessons learned from this engagement. Combat was unpredictable, and survival often depended more on adaptability and determination than on following established procedures. The most important weapon any soldier could carry wasn't a rifle or grenade. It was the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect their teammates and complete their mission. The forest that had been filled with violence just hours before was now peaceful again, with only scattered equipment and disturbed earth to mark where the engagement had taken place. But for Sarah and her teammates, the memory of those 65 seconds would remain with them for the rest of their lives as a reminder of what was possible when training, courage, and sheer determination came together in the face of impossible odds.